Okay, thank you to the organizers, and thank you everyone for your attention. I'm interested in musical rhythm and the fact that we feel a beat and we move our bodies to the beat, and that we have neural responses that occur at the rates that are associated with the beat and can entrain to those rhythms. I'm also interested in cultural differences. So cultures vary widely in the kinds of rhythms that they tend to use in their music, and these rhythms have different metrical structures, different beat rates, etc. We also see cultural differences, not just in the rhythms that people use, but the way we perceive rhythms. And so if you have two different cultural groups, they may hear the exact same rhythm in very different ways. They may feel a beat in one way for one culture and in another way for another culture. So with this talk, I'm going to talk about some data about how neural and behavioral entrainment relate to each other in the context of cultural differences. Okay, so what did we do? We had two basic experiments that are very simple in very similar in their design, but they had different samples. So in the first experiment, I compared an East African sample from Kigali, Rwanda, to a North American sample back home in Canada. In the second experiment, we compared two cultural samples from Botswana, so the San cultural group, and the Hambukushu, and also another sample from North America. And what we did was have people do two tasks, at least there's a couple others that I'm not going to talk about today, but a passive listening task while we recorded EEG. So this was just listening to rhythms. I'll play some examples for you in a minute. And their task was to stay awake and listen to those rhythms. What we measured in EEG was neural entrainment, or what I'll call neural entrainment, at the different beat rates associated with the rhythms. Now, this is using the SSAP, or steady state evoked potential method, or frequency tagging, as it's called sometimes, as has been developed by Sylvie Nozaraden. I want to just make clear here that I can't separate the evoked and the endogenous kind of fluctuations within this signal that I'm capturing. So with SSEPs, I don't truly know that this is neural entrainment if we're thinking of entrainment as the an underlying internal oscillation. The other task was a beat tapping task. So we had people listen to the same rhythms that they heard in the passive listening EEG task, and we asked them to tap along with their sense of the steady beat. And we tried to make clear to people that they should not tap the rhythm, but tap the steady beat that goes along with that. But besides that, we did not guide them about what beat to tap. So you can see some pictures here, collecting EEG from this participant in a Hambukushu village, and Jessica's collecting beat tapping data from a participant in a San village in Botswana. We used culturally informed rhythms as stimuli. So for the first experiment, we used rhythms that were derived from traditional East African music and also from Western music. And here's an example of one of the East African rhythms. And here's an example of one of the Western rhythms. And in the second experiment, we had rhythms derived from traditional music of the San culture, the Hambukushu, and also Western music. Here's a San rhythm. Here's a Hambukushu rhythm. And a Western rhythm. So if you have any questions about the rhythms, why we use two voices, how I transcribed these, the tempo variants that we used, I'd be happy to answer questions about that, but I'm going to skip over it for now for the sake of time. So just to summarize again, we wanted to compare the patterns of neural entrainment to the different beat rates and the patterns of behavioral entrainment to the different beat rates from these different cultural samples while listening to the same rhythms. We want to look for differences across the cultural groups and effects of culture, so a bias towards culturally familiar rhythms, but also looking at brain-behavior relationships. Okay, so in the first experiment, I'm going to show group differences in the beat tapping data. So this is a graph showing the beat tapping bias. So this is the proportion on the y-axis of trials overall in the experiment in which participants selected this particular beat rate or these particular beat rates to tap. So we can see some clear group differences, for example, most notably at this slowest beat rate, for which East African participants were much more likely to tap than North Americans. Another thing about the beat tapping that differed between these cultural groups is the what I might call flexibility. So the East African participants used more beat rates over the course of the experiment than North Americans did. So this is listening to all the exact same rhythms. The two groups, the East African participants tended to use more beat rates. Now, what about the neural entrainment, the EEG measures? So what I'm plotting here, this is the North American participants on the top, East African participants on the bottom. And this is the normalized EEG spectral power. So this is how much neural entrainment, I'm going to call it here, is occurring at these different beat rates indicated by the black circles. We see that they correspond to the beat rates that I was talking about earlier. And you can see some clear differences between not the groups just yet, I'll get to that in a second, but the different types of rhythms. So the East African rhythms, entrainment to the East African rhythms is plotted in blue, and entrainment to the Western rhythms is plotted in red. So you can see for both groups, at some beat rates, there's much more entrainment to the East African rhythms, and for other beat rates, much more entrainment to the Western rhythms. Now, what we didn't find is an interaction between the type of rhythm that people were listening to, the beat rate, and the group. So there isn't this clear affective culture in which people were biased in their neural responses toward one type of rhythm over another, depending on their familiarity to that type of rhythm. We also don't see a one-to-one correspondence between the beat tapping distribution here and the neural entrainment distribution here. And I'll show another graph in a minute to better demonstrate that. There were, however, group differences between in neural power in the slowest frequencies and in the fastest frequencies. And it's this pulse level frequency kind of corresponding to the underlying fastest level of the metrical hierarchy, or the pulse, that I'm interested in. So I'm going to come back to that pulse entrainment, but first here is just the same neural entrainment data, but broken down into bar graphs to show collapsing over the two types of rhythms, how much entrainment there was for the two different samples, East African participants and North American participants, for the different beat rates. So here this allows us to really directly compare the behavioral entrainment and neural entrainment. And we don't see a clear correspondence. There isn't the same pattern. That's, I think, fairly straightforward. However, I'm interested in this difference in entrainment at the pulse. And what I was curious about when I explored this data was whether this might relate to the behavioral difference that we're seeing in beat tapping flexibility. It has a kind of surface level correspondence that the East African group is greater than the North American group. And just to my mind, there was some intuitive sense that it's this underlying pulse that's really important in tracking rhythm and in tracking the different possible beat rates. So the fact that one might be more entrained at the pulse level, that makes sense to me that could correspond to greater flexibility to tap at and consider different beat rates. It also, this group difference or this entrainment at the pulse level might correspond to the kind of distribution, these kind of more rich data that represents something about beat tapping flexibility. So where might we look for that kind of relationship? We might expect that tapping is better for those who have more entrainment at the pulse level. We don't find a significant association, although it's going in that kind of direction. But another way we can look at this is this distribution of the beat tapping data is to look at the kurtosis of that distribution. So if we plot the kurtosis, and I'm putting negative going up, this is basically an indication of how flat the distribution is. A higher bar here, more negative kurtosis, is indicating a flatter distribution, and a more positive or lower on this graph, kurtosis, is indicating a more peaky distribution. This measure of what I would call beat tapping flexibility corresponds in this kind of surface level to the pulse rate entrainment. Okay, what about experiment 2? So now we've got 3 different samples that we're comparing. We've got the San in blue, the Hamkushu in yellow, and the North American in red. I accidentally gave you a little preview of the brain data there. These are the beat tapping data. So these are the proportion of trials in which the different groups tended to tap a given beat rates. So again, we can see some clear group differences. The Hamkushu were much more likely to tap this slower rate than the other groups, and much less likely, by some margin, to tap this second to fastest rate than the other 2 groups. You can see other group differences across the different beat rates. What about in the brain? We see group differences, most notably in this kind of fastest pulse level, and a couple other marginal effects or a significant difference here. But overall, we do not see, again, in this second experiment, a correspondence between behavioral and neural entrainment. But I want to now follow up on these ideas I was mentioning about pulse level entrainment. So this is just the same data made bigger here. One thing that this does correspond to in this sample, as it did in the previous sample, is this measure of flexibility, that is kurtosis. So the kurtosis of these beat tapping distributions for each of the groups is plotted here. More negative going up, again, is indicating a flatter distribution. The flatter distribution, I consider that tapping flexibility, and it corresponds in this, in terms of the pattern across groups, to the neural entrainment to the pulse. So this is some kind of like ongoing evidence that maybe there is something to this, that the neural entrainment to the pulse maybe affords beat tapping flexibility. I should say that we did not find the same even the direction of the association between beat tapping stability and pulse level entrainment, neural entrainment. We also didn't find the correspondence between pulse level entrainment and the number of beat rates tapped, as we found in experiment 1. Okay, I'm going to summarize. So we found that cultural groups differ in their neural and behavioral entrainment, but that these group differences don't necessarily correspond. Brain and behavior are not readily explaining one another in these kind of measures. However, I'm kind of putting out there that it could be that neural entrainment to the underlying pulse of rhythms supports flexible beat perception, and that's reflected in these cultural differences that we've seen. Why would that be? I mean, as I was explaining earlier, it makes some intuitive sense to me that internal tracking of the fastest underlying rate of a metrical structure would support perception and behavior for those other beat rates, which are multiples of that pulse. And it also corresponds to what I think a lot of musicians hear and know anecdotally, that we subdivide the beat. So if we're counting along to music, we don't just count the beats, but we sub-vocalize the pulse. So this might be totally silent. We're doing this internally, but we're counting the kind of fastest level of the, or tracking the fastest level of the rhythmic structure. And that's a strategy. We do that intentionally to keep better time and to more precisely produce rhythms. So a next step I'd like to do is to put this idea forward and do an experiment where people learn culturally unfamiliar rhythms, and as they learn them, we can see any shifts in their perception or their tendency to tap one beat rate over another, and the extent to which they readily learn these rhythms and new beat rates might be predicted by the kind of baseline entrainment to the pulse of the rhythm. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm eager to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that amazing talk. I'm going to turn to the audience we have here in person. Would anyone like to start the questions?
Okay, hi Dan. Thanks for a great talk. 2 questions / comments. I just wonder why, I find it a bit interesting and perhaps surprising that you don't find, like in your strong neural entrainment to the pulse layer, that they actually tap in all cases. How do you explain this? That's the first one, and the next one is that it would be very interesting to see the same thing done with a polyrhythm, and if you could see, like, find the same thing regarding flexibility there with different cultures that are very familiar with the polyrhythmic structure and cultures that are not. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, that's interesting. In terms of the first question, why do we not find this kind of one-to-one correspondence? If someone's listening to a given rhythm and in one situation they're tapping along with their sense of the beat, and then another situation they're just listening passively. I think it's that these weren't recorded at the same time. It wasn't the case that people were tapping. I think in the work that's out there that has shown these things, it's not shocking to me that if you have someone tapping along and you record EEG, then you see a strong entrainment at that pulse that they're tapping. I think it has to do with the task that they're doing right then. So I think when we're listening passively, in some ways this is less controlled. I don't know what every single listener, what every single participant was doing, how engaged they were, what they were paying attention to. But it's also somewhat naturalistic. When we hear music, we're just hearing things. We're hearing all these different periodicities. They are all present in this rhythmic structure of the music. And so I think what this is maybe more getting at is just the kind of bias of our neural dynamics and what they're entraining to on their own, without kind of doing some overt task of trying to tap along or to count the number of beats or emphasize certain beats or that kind of thing. So that might be one reason we're not finding this one-to-one correspondence. In terms of polyrhythms, yeah, I mean the rhythms that I use that were derived from especially the African traditional musics tend to have more of a polyrhythmic structure. There's kind of 3-2 structure overall. I think that has to do with this flexibility. I mean, flexibility is one thing when it's like either I tap the 8th note or the quarter note. That's not that interesting. That's not that hard to go from one to the other. It's really different to be able to hear a 12-unit rhythm in 4 groups of 3 or 3 groups of 4. I had to take out of the talk for the sake of time a kind of demonstration of this, but some of the African timelines that are kind of like clave patterns people might be familiar with, you can feel in multiple ways, and both of them fit. I think this has to do with that music. So you might predict then people who are familiar with that music are going to be more generally flexible. If that's not what I saw necessarily. So there's different African cultures, they have different musical traditions, and they differed in terms of how flexible they were. And North Americans were not necessarily always less than all the African samples I compared them to. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great. Just can I follow up just shortly? Because did you see more flexibility in the participants coming from the African, parts of Africa that have more polyrhythmic structures in the music?
It's difficult. So I'm not a musicologist. I'm not an ethnomusicologist. That's a big limitation of what I'm able to do here. I did my best to kind of transcribe some ethnographic recordings to make these rhythms, but I don't know the musical culture super well. So I don't have a good, I'm not confident in saying that African culture has more polyrhythmic structure than that one. To my ears, all 3 of the African samples that I tested, their musics have some polyrhythmic structure to it, and more than Western music traditionally does. But we didn't see uniform, flexibility, this measure of flexibility of how distributed their tapping was differed from one African group to another. So, so it's not fully explained that way, I don't
Thanks.
think.
Thanks. And we also have a question from an ethnomusicologist or musicologist, Reiner Polak online. Fascinating study and data. Any idea why African groups showed strong sensory motor synchronization or tapping on the dotted quarter note in experiment 2, but not experiment 1? And there's a follow-up. Did you take some measure of relative familiarity, confirming that, for example, San participants felt more similar with San their own rhythms than other rhythms? Sorry, I cannot read it properly. Did you catch all of that, Dan?
Yes, so I hope so. So in terms of familiarity, I didn't report all of the data that we collected in these experiments and all of the results. So we published some of the behavioral data for the East African compared to North Americans, and we do find some effects of familiarity there. So people were tapping a little bit more accurately for the rhythms that we think are going to be more familiar to them. And they reproduce those rhythms when they tap the rhythm back a little more accurately when it's the rhythm that we expect was familiar. This is difficult because for the second experiment, especially because there are only 2 rhythms associated with each of the cultural groups. These were my kind of transcriptions. So I don't have a lot of confidence that these should be equally familiar to each of the groups and independent of the other ones, in the sense that, yeah, so this isn't, perfectly controlled for familiarity in that way. I'm trying to remember the first part of the question. Why did we not see as much
And why
dotted quarter tapping?
why they showed stronger tapping on the dotted quarter note in experiment 2, but not experiment 1 in the African groups?
Yeah, I think it depends on which groups and which rhythms. I think one thing about experiment 1 and 2 is that they're different sets of rhythms. Even the the Western rhythms rather, were even a different set of rhythms that I made for that experiment compared to the first one. There may have been some overlap, but mostly different. So, this isn't, I'd have to look at which rhythms corresponded to which type of tapping in which group. So that's a finer grained analysis than I was reporting here. But Reiner, I'd love to talk to you more about it sometime and get your feedback. I think this is one limitation I have, is not being an ethnomusicologist and not being as informed about the rhythms that these groups are working with. So I think I've tried to focus on, okay, just like the group differences, and not interpret too much why one group versus another might differ in some kind of behavior, although I think that's really interesting and worthwhile and ultimately important. But if we can explain group differences in terms of brain and behavioral measures, I think that could be a path forward, and that's what I've tried to do here.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, Dan. We're going to move on to the next presentation for time. All right.
Thank you.
Cheers. See you.